Now please let me welcome the first speaker of today, our keynote speaker, Prime Minister of the Czech Republic, Petr Fiala.
Ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, dear guests, it's an honor for me to address the Forum 2000 conference. When I see the number 2000 all around me, I feel nostalgic. The year 2000 used to be a symbol of hope. We used to imagine our future world with a great deal of optimism. I will always associate this kind of thinking with our former President Václav Havel, the co-founder of this conference. When the year 2000 finally arrived, the West was indeed celebrating, but not for long. Soon the terrorists from Al-Qaeda stopped the party and brought an era of new threats. And we have still not recovered. This was a shock to the United States, but also to Europe, which had been enjoying a period of easygoing passivity. We were very optimistic about our future, but also grossly underestimating our security. Current Russian attack on Ukraine is in a similar turning point. There are two acts. First, the occupation of Crimea in 2014, and second, the full-scale war that began 6 months ago. We missed the opportunity to respond to the first act. We have tolerated the behavior of the Russian regime for many reasons. That is why the second act is much more difficult. Once again, brutal war was returned to Europe. Once again, we must confront an evil that threatens our civilization. The Czech Republic and the European Union are helping Ukraine to defend its sovereignty and integrity. We are managing the refugee crisis. We are planning the post-war reconstruction of critical infrastructure. The decision of the Russian dictator cannot be justified, and his war crimes will not escape punishment. No one who bombs hospitals will get away with it. Russia is taking us decades back to the language of the Cold War, to a world divided into spheres controlled by superpowers. We do not want such a world, especially when the spheres are not based on mutual trade, but on blackmail, abuse, and military force. I must stress that the war in Ukraine is not a regional problem. It affects absolutely everyone. You may argue that the fate of one European country cannot be a global priority. However, this is not just about Ukraine. This is about the whole system of international relations. If Ukraine, a country of 40 million people, is not safe, no one is safe. Think about Taiwan, Central Asia, Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, the Russians have violated their own security guarantees since 1994. In exchange, Ukraine had to give up nuclear weapons which could be used today to deter these aggressors. What kind of signal is this? These security challenges do threaten the whole world. We must respond to them by the determined action of democratic countries. We must decide what kind of international order we want to build, a system where it makes sense to make agreements, or a system where aggression is a norm. International rules have always been important, but they are especially important today. It is simply too dangerous to gamble with weapons of mass destruction. These are global challenges that each generation must resolve again and again. And I am glad about one thing, that Vladimir Putin's attack is refreshing the alliance of Western democracies. NATO is expanding and gaining momentum. The European Union is working well, agreeing on basic priorities and solutions easily. The next challenge is to maintain and deepen the global consensus on basic security issues, not only within the West, but also with other democracies. It is natural that each country has its own objectives, but we must all strive to live in a predictable environment. This is our common interests. That is why we want to build a better network of relationships, both formal and informal, that would protect those who are at risk. We must engage in a more intensive dialogue with our partners. We must prove that the liberal order brings concrete benefits. We must make clear that we are not afraid to stand up for our allies, because our freedom depends on their freedom. As the Prime Minister of the Czech Republic, I say that we are well aware of these challenges. That is why we are striving for more consistent support to democracies around the world and working to end our dependence on rogue countries. It's a priority of our own foreign policy, and it's a priority for our presidency of the EU Council. Ladies and gentlemen, in one of my books, I wrote that European politics was facing the end of the age of passivity. But this has moved on. Today, we are no longer at the end. The age of passivity is over for good. Now is the time to make decisions. The world around us is changing, and we must act. The dreams of the year 2000 are long behind us. We have learned our lessons. We must work with our partners to enhance global security. We need new visions and new deadlines, and I am counting on you, the world's great thinkers, to help define them for the sake of the free world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. And now we would like to give the floor to a man that needs no introduction, the informal leader of the free world, a person who leads his country in this terrible conflict, President Volodymyr Zelensky.
Thank you very much, dear Mr. Prime Minister Fiala, dear participants of the forum. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for the opportunity to address you today. Today is the 189th day of full-scale war of the Ukrainian people for its freedom. However, it's a war not only for our people. At different times, in different parts of the world, you see battles like that where the freedom is at stake, and it's either emerges victorious or is defeated. For many countries and for a long time, we all recall 1968 when people were striving for freedom, where they were fighting for freedom, and where when a historical chance appeared in the very center of Europe. However, this chance was destroyed by the Russian tanks in Prague. The world failed to recognize the scale of this battle and what was being destroyed. It didn't see what the result of victory would have been. And Europe is still have to deal with the consequences of giving tyranny another 20 years. That the tyranny could sustain because freedom was not supported, because freedom wasn't given a chance to reveal itself to its fullest. What did it lead to? To deaths and sufferings, to waves of refugees and asylum seekers, to the countries in the east and center of Europe having to remain without freedom for several decades, not only without political, cultural, or individual freedoms. The economical freedoms and other expressions of normal social development were taken away from them. Only their kids and grandkids receive those opportunities and well-being that their fathers, who were young at the time of the Prague Spring, were young. But what is even more fearful is that the supporters of tyranny who lived at that time and witnessed the destruction of freedom with the tanks, all those who were frustrated with freedom, who didn't want to respect the rights of people to self-determination, it was then that this illusion that freedom can be suppressed by tanks was born, the illusion that you have to be just cruel enough and send enough tanks to make the democratic world scared. This illusion is at the heart of the full-scale invasion of Russia into Ukraine that was started on February the 24th this year. But it is here on our land, and now we have another historical chance to destroy this illusion. Ukraine is a battlefield of the decisive fight for freedom, and I thank you for not leaving us alone. I thank you for your support. I thank you for the unity that we preserve, and I would like to recognize a special role of the Czech Republic in the defense of freedom. It is important. Personal involvement of Prime Minister Fiala and other representatives of the state are very important. We have already achieved a lot. The tyranny now feels that free people can defend themselves and that the victory of freedom is very probable. We achieved this in different areas, from the front lines where the Ukrainian women and men physically defend freedom, to the political one where we achieved a lot for the entire Europe. Ukraine managed to get its candidacy status in the EU, and I thank the people of Czechia, your government and parliament, for your support on our European path. However, the battle isn't over. The front line is 2.5 thousand kilometers. Active hostilities are going on in the front line, 1,300 kilometers long. Can you imagine? It's as long as the road from Kiev to Prague, and Russia pulls everything it has to the front, and they have large stockpiles of weapons and munitions from Soviet times, and the invaders do not restrict themselves with any norms of any conventions or elementary humanity. They cruelly shell our cities using artillery every day and every night. Our people die because of shelling, because of missile and air strikes. Mass-scale terror against people in the occupied territory is at the level Europe hasn't seen since World War II. Russia is blackmailing Ukraine, Europe, and the world with the radiation catastrophe at Zaporizhzhia NPP. Just think about it. No other enemy of humanity ever tried to blackmail it with making a nuclear power plant a battlefield, part of a battlefield. Therefore, we have to do a lot together in order to win in this battle. Ukraine needs constant and adequate support with arms and ammunition. We also need financial support, and all leaders of the free world, heads of European structures know about this need of ours. In order to defeat the enemy, we need financial resilience, and the world equipped freedom in this battle against tyranny with the powerful sanctions against Russia. However, the potential of the terrorist state hasn't been fully destroyed, and therefore new sanction packages are needed for the radiation blackmail at Zaporizhzhia, NPP, Rosatom, and the nuclear industry have to suffer blocking sanctions. All potential aggressor states in the world should understand, because of the sanctions, that the price of a nuclear blackmail is too much for them to chew. It is time to block the banking system of Russia. It's nonsensical that the Russian banks can still work with the global financial system when the Russian state is trying to do all it can in order to damage the world as much as it can. We have also felt the acuteness of the food crisis and we reduce it. We have to do all we can in order to reduce or eliminate the acuteness of the energy crisis that the Russia is using to derail our unity and our potential to defend. Therefore, we have to do what we can in order to make it impossible for Russia to make money selling its energy sources. On our behalf, we can offer EU countries its electricity. It's cheaper than elsewhere. Ukraine is now part of the European grid, and we can export much more electricity than we are doing today. And this may help fight price crisis, at least to its neighbors in the European Union, which will certainly make the price crisis in the entire Europe less acute. We have to understand that no country in Europe, neither Ukraine nor the Czech Republic, nor any other, shouldn't stand alone amidst this natural gas crisis. And finally, there should be a value-based reaction to all that the tyranny brought to Europe. And I do hope that you will support the idea of creating and supporting the activity of the special tribunal in order to punish the crime of aggression committed by those who unleashed the war against Ukraine. And naturally, we have to do all we can, acting together in order to punish everyone who killed, tortured, and deported Ukrainians. And by the way, this will be an historic punishment to the system that sent tanks to you in 1968. And we have to make yet another value-based step, ethical one. propaganda mongers from Russia can still operate in Europe, and the Russian TV is still accessible to European viewers. The TV, which is the world's biggest disinformer, who do they work against? What are they trying to destroy or discredit? The European democracy, and Europe needs to have full protection against the Russian propaganda. Not a single Russian propaganda monger should stay in the territory of EU. Not a single Russian state TV channel should be allowed to keep working in the territory of EU, and the territory of EU should be closed to those citizens of Russia that use Europe in order to take a break from the evil that condone with it at home, staying silent. Visa restrictions will make Russian citizens understand that freedom is something they have to fight for. And closing the European visa space for Russian tourists will also protect countries from killers like in Salisbury or Verbietice. Ladies and gentlemen, I have no doubt that we will win in this battle for freedom. I have no doubt whatsoever that we are able to protect Europe against all crises that Russia keeps creating. And I have no doubt that we will recover and rebuild what's been destroyed by war. But in order to make this happen, we cannot have doubts in our ability to preserve our unity, the unity of Europeans and of the free world. I do believe that the Czech presidency of the Council of Europe will further strengthen our unity. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your support. Slava Ukraini. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's an honor to listen to you. We take your words seriously. We will discuss them. Many of the points that you made are part of the discussions at this conference. We wish you strength, good luck, and we are with your nation and with you in this difficult battle. And now please let me take the opportunity to welcome our next speaker, somebody who also does not need an introduction, one of the most influential thinkers of our time, Professor Franz Fukuyama. Francis Fukuyama.
Thank you very, very much for the invitation to speak to Forum 2000. It's an incredible honor to me to follow Prime Minister Fiala and, of course, the very heroic President Zelensky. And I also want to congratulate this country, the Czech Republic, for the contributions that it has made since well before the fall of communism to freedom in the world. Václav Havel talked about the power of the powerless, and he demonstrated through his life and actions that that can defeat tanks in the end, that can be a powerful idea in the world. And this country continues to uphold those principles today. So thank you very much for that. I only want to talk about 3 topics. I want to talk about why this war in Ukraine started. Second, I want to address the question of its global significance. And then I want to close by reflecting a little bit on the future and what may happen. So let me begin with the first issue. Why did Russia invade Ukraine? There has been an argument that began before the war that this war was driven essentially by the West, by the expansion of the NATO alliance into the territories that had been formerly dominated by the Soviet Union. And even today, you find people opposed to support for Ukraine on the grounds that it's basically the West's fault that this happened. I suspect very few people in this room believe this argument, but I think it's one that needs to be answered very, very clearly. So there are several problems with that view. The first is that it's not as if the leaders of NATO sitting in Washington or London or Paris said, how are we going to expand this alliance all the way up to the borders of the former USSR? Let's figure out how to do that. NATO expansion was driven by this country, by Poland, by the Baltic states, by all of the countries that had been part of the former Warsaw Pact, as well as by countries that were liberated after 1991 and the collapse of the former Soviet Union, because they knew what it was like to live under Soviet domination, and they believed that the moment the balance of power changed sufficiently, no guarantee of the Russians would be sufficient to protect their security. And it is they that were the primary drivers of that expansion. And we should be glad that NATO responded to that. The second has to do with listening to Russia itself, because of course the Russians didn't like NATO expansion. But I do not believe that that was their fundamental motive. President Putin wrote a long article that appeared about this time last year. He gave a long speech before the invasion on February 24th, in which he said very clearly that his major concern was actually recreating a great Russia that dominated as large an area as at least the former Soviet Union. And he denied very clearly that Ukraine was a separate country, that the Ukrainians had any agency in determining their own future because they were all part of one people. And ever since the war broke out, they have gotten more and more extreme in their assertions that Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian language, Ukrainian people that assert their right to be separate from Russia, they need to be actually destroyed and killed. So that is really the underlying issue for them. And finally, I would say that many of the Western opponents of aid to Ukraine argue from a so-called realist perspective. They say, well, we've looked at human history and we see that great powers require spheres of influence, and it's just not reasonable to think that a great power like Russia would settle for an opposing alliance all the way up to its borders. And, you know, it's a very odd argument, I think, certainly for an academic to make, because it basically doesn't take account of the changes in global norms that have happened over the past century. Yes, in the 19th century, you had colonial powers that were happy to rule over other people, but, you know, I would point out that very few countries live by that standard anymore and believe that they have a right to dominate involuntarily another country simply in order to have a buffer against some imaginary enemy. You've actually had an expansion of a belief in democratic sovereignty. Isn't that a surprise, that people don't want to be dominated in this fashion? And so I think the realist argument is actually extremely unreal. It doesn't take account of the world as it actually is. All right, the second issue has to do with global significance. As the Prime Minister pointed out, this is not just a matter between Ukraine and Russia. It is something that, in fact, affects all of us. Now, there has been a global democratic backsliding after the so-called third wave of democratization that began in the early 1970s. There was a massive expansion of democracies from maybe about 35 in the early 70s to, let's say, 100, 110, 115 by the early 2000s. But as Freedom House has pointed out, for each of the last 16 years, there has been backsliding. There's been backsliding all over the world, including in many countries that we had hoped would become more democratic, like Myanmar, like Tunisia, like Nicaragua, like any number of other places. And the qualitative changes have also been significant. Freedom House pointed out that two of the biggest backsliders in recent years were the world's two largest democracies, the United States and India, which have seen the rise of illiberal populism in their own societies. As an American, things have happened in my country that I, even 5 years, maybe 10 years ago would not have believed possible, that people would vote for a demagogic, populist nationalist who is not willing to accept a democratic, peaceful democratic transfer of power, was willing to use violence to overturn a legitimate election. And that has obviously had a devastating effect on global democracy just in itself because of the example that the United States held to many countries for being a good, secure, and stable democracy. And I'm sorry to say that with the rise of populist nationalism in many other places, in Hungary, in many European countries, in Brazil, and so forth, this is a phenomenon that is still with us. It is still a threat in the United States, and it is not an accident that President Putin is very popular with this particular crowd. People like Salvini in Italy, Zemmour and Marine Le Pen in France, Viktor Orban in Hungary, and Donald Trump like Mr. Putin, and they like him because he is not a liberal. Putin himself said that liberalism is an obsolete doctrine. What they want is a world in which a strong man can cut through all of the constraints that a liberal society places on executive authority and just get things done. And that's been the argument that's been put forward very strongly by China and Russia in recent years. Unlike these squabbling, ineffective democracies, we can do things. And proving that wrong is incredibly important for the future of democracy elsewhere. The idea that democracy is not a fatal constraint, but it actually leads to stronger action because it's based on a strong social consensus. And so that's really the issue that is wrapped up in the war in Ukraine. Now, finally, the war itself. I think that as a political scientist, a lot of times we say, well, the military use of force is not going to determine outcomes. That's all fundamentally politics. In this case, I'm afraid to say that's not true. Very much depends on what happens on the battlefield in Ukraine in the coming weeks and months, and for the following reason. As you are all aware, right now there's a big problem in Europe with sanctions because many people are facing a shortage of energy. It's going to be a cold winter in Europe, and the ability to maintain sanctions depends on political will, and that political will in turn depends on what the prospects for the conflict in Ukraine are. Over the summer, The Economist had a cover that said that this is going to be a long war, and that is very bad for Ukraine, because once Europeans are convinced that this is going to be a war that will continue year after year, like the frozen conflicts in the Donbass and in Georgia and in other places, then they're going to say, sorry, we have to have a peace settlement. We cannot survive sanctions. On the other hand, if Ukraine is able to regain military momentum in the coming weeks and months, then I think it is much easier for Western politicians to say, we need to suffer, we're going to suffer for this winter, but it's not going to go on forever, because there is an outcome that will be much more favorable to Ukraine and to Western democracy. And that is why what's going on right now in the south of Ukraine is incredibly important to all of us. I would just say I've been more optimistic than many of my colleagues about Ukraine's military prospects fighting Russia. I have never believed this conventional wisdom that Russia has endless resources and therefore it is inevitable that Ukraine is going to lose this war. I think the Russians could lose, or they could certainly lose in the south, and Ukraine can liberate Kherson and other territories that are critical to opening up its Black Sea coast and therefore opening up the country as a whole to international trade on which its economic survival depends. And so I think with the rest of you, I wish the best to all of those incredibly brave Ukrainians that are fighting on our behalf. I hope that they have a swift and clear victory and that happens soon. And if it does, I believe that we can get through this collectively as a worldwide democratic community. So, Slava Ukraini, Geroya Slava.
So, what an opening. Thank you very much, Prime Minister Fiala, President Zelensky, Professor Fukuyama. And now we are about to start the panel discussions. And for the first panel, which is aimed at looking beyond this conflict, looking at the time when Ukraine wins this war, what is the vision for success of Ukraine? And to discuss this, I would like to welcome the panel led by Minister of Foreign Affairs of Czech Republic, Mr. Jan Lipavský.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me invite guests and panelists, which are Minister of Foreign Affairs of Germany. Please come to join us. Yes. Annalena Baerbock, please, Dmytro Kuleba, Zbigniew Frau, Joseph Borrell sadly needs to travel back to sorry. Perfect. And Wopke, please join us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let me start with very little personal perspective, because we have just concluded informal meeting of Ministers of Foreign Affairs of the EU, and we had an informal lunch with Ministers of Associated Trial to the EU, which Ukraine and Dmytro was one of those guests. And these 2 days here in Prague, we had very open and frank debate on how to tackle with future progress. And it was demonstrated on the issue of visas, issuing touristic visas, and it's a complex matter. And we agree that we need to do action. We sometimes differ in our answers. But in the end of the day, we are ready to provide that answer and move on. And my perspective is that this is sometimes quite a heated debate. So then to switch into the conference mode and to discuss matter in broader scope demands a little bit of concentration. But thank you very much, all of you guests, for participating in this conference. This conference has one vision, and this vision is to bring Ukraine into the EU. We know it won't be easy. We know it won't happen overnight. It may take years, maybe, I don't know. It may take. We see the other enlargement processes being sometimes stuck in different kind of negotiations and processes. My thesis, my personal thesis, is that the political alignment is absolute key. Once we agree politically, we can find way, and the rest of that will be matter of processes. And yes, we have to agree on rule of law, we have to agree on many things, and those chapters definitely include that. But in the very beginning, there needs to be political alignment. And of course, we are living in an extraordinary times. You face onslaught, you face war, something which we don't want to imagine half a year ago. And yes, we have to ask ourselves, what can we do for Ukraine to survive this onslaught? What can we do for Europe to protect its architecture of security, which we built it? We built that security architecture with Soviet Union. The Helsinki Act, OCEC was founded with agreement of Soviet Union when we again stated that borders won't be changed by force. So thank you very much again for participation, and I'll start with questions. Dmitro, when will you win the war? And what do you need to do to support you?
We definitely will win the war.
Thank you.
It doesn't matter how much time it takes. And it is true that some emphasize the point that this is the war of attrition, it may last, it's too long, we cannot afford it. I think when we defend our lifestyle, our principles, our values, we have to fight as long as it is needed until we prevail. And when Putin, on the 24th of February, Putin did not attack only Ukraine. He attacked the West as a concept. And he attacked every household here in Europe, in North America, or in Asia, where countries share the same principles and values. The only difference is that while he attacked Ukraine with missiles and tanks, he attacked Europeans and others with energy crisis, with inflation, with propaganda. And the best Putin wants to achieve is to see doubts. Doubts in victory, doubts in our ability to defend what we stand for. Doubts are like erosion. They erode confidence, they erode commitment, and we have to come to a very simple conclusion. You know, there are discussions about how this war will end. I think, you know, there is a saying, perception becomes reality. If we set ourselves a goal that the end of this war will be the victory of Ukraine, and the victory of Ukraine means the restoration of its territorial integrity and the securing its right to decide its own future, as every democratic nation does, that perception will become a reality. That perception will identify our moves, our decisions, and it will become a reality. One thing that follows up directly from the conversation that we had on visas, because visas is just a big topic now, so let's take it as an example. On our way to victory, we will always be facing difficult choices. And we will always be tempted to take half measures, to strike balances, to take half measures against the aggressor. But the truth, the sad truth, is that the age of peace in Europe is over. And the age of half measures is over too. We have to be resolved, we have to be committed. Yes, we have to be tough, but this is the only way how you win wars. Especially a war against a country like Russia, led by President Putin. So if I have to face a situation when I have to choose between a half measure on, for example, visas and a real measure and no measure, I will prefer a no measure. I will prefer to take more time to discuss, more time to find a solution that will introduce a real tough measure that will deliver. This is the policy that can take us to victory, that will take us to victory. I don't know the calendar, the schedule, but I will I'm absolutely confident, and I want to assure you that this is not only my personal confidence, it's how people of Ukraine feel. We have to win this war, and we will win it.
Thank you. And we are with you. And thank you for advice how to do decisions in the EU.
As an incoming member, you know.
Annalena, what is the German vision for successful Ukraine? How would you define successful Ukraine?
Well, first of all, thanks for the invitation and good afternoon. But this is not a German vision, because what we are fighting for, what Ukraine is fighting for, is for the right every country has to define their own future by themselves. So it's not up to Germany, but I've been discussing with my friend Dimitro for a very long time now, because 6 months in a time of war seems like ages. And so I know what, not the vision, but what the future of Ukraine is, what Dimitro just said himself. And this is a free and peaceful Ukraine, like every other country in the world. And Ukraine has a right. And this is why we made very clear today at our informal council, but also with an input paper I gave together with my French colleague, making clear that we stand with Ukraine as long as they need us. And because we all agree on this, and this is not a sentence to applause for, because this is just a normal thing if you believe in the rule of law and in the freedom in the world, I would maybe give some controversy in the discussion, and I've listened to your speech, which I really valued, but I would disagree on one sentence you said, of saying we shouldn't talk about maybe this war should go on for a longer time. Because if I give the promise as a politician, and luckily in democracy, it could be the chance that people disagree with me and they say in 4 years, well, you didn't tell us the truth. But if I give the promise to people in Ukraine, we stand with you as long as you need us, then I want to deliver, no matter what my German voters think, but I want to deliver to the people of Ukraine. And this is why, for me, it's important to be always very frank and clear. And this means every measure I'm taking, I have to be clear that this holds on as long as Ukraine needs me. And this is why I think it's so important that we have to be frank. Yes, everybody wishes from us that tomorrow the war stops, but in case tomorrow it wouldn't stop, I will be also there in 2 years' time. And then sometimes it sounds a bit difficult on the EU level, and this is also where we disagree sometimes on measures the European Union is taking, because every sanction package we have to prepare that it holds also for the next maybe 2 years. If we don't need it 2 years long, well, this is great. But if we would need it, it has to hold as long as Ukraine needs us. And we are facing now a winter time where we will be challenged as democratic politicians. People will go on the street and say, we cannot pay our energy prices. And I will say, yes, I know, so we help you with social measures. But I don't want to say, okay, then we stop the sanctions against Russia. We will stand with Ukraine, and this means the sanction will stay also in wintertime, even if it gets really tough for politicians, and we have to find good solution all over Europe to balance the social effects, because this is the other part of this war. It's a hybrid war. The second strategy is to split our democracies, saying, okay, now the poor people are being left behind, and we have to give the answers. No, we stand in solidarity with everybody in our country as we stand with everybody in Ukraine.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Minister Zbigniew, Poland has a crucial role in supporting Ukraine in this war, and I think it is very much admired for it. Also looking at the pace you are procuring for your army, I think there's it's a clear statement. How do you see security situation in Europe? But back to the integration of Ukraine into the EU. Is it possible to be working on it now, when the war is still raging? It is credible to be discussing reforms, and the meme says that we have to align the shape of banana and whatever. Is it really this time?
Well, certainly this is the time to talk and act for the future of Ukraine. And the future of Ukraine is going to be decided in two dimensions. First of all, it's absolutely crucial. Ukraine has to win the war. It's up to the Ukrainians to win this war, and they are doing a remarkable job, showing love for freedom, independence, sovereignty, and simply human dignity every day. And they are pursuing this path with enormous determination and heroism. But for them, in order to win this war as soon as possible, because I suppose this is something you are alluding to, it's necessary to help them as much as we can, militarily, politically, diplomatically, and economically. And quite frankly, the President Fiala has just said that the time of passivity, what was the time of being passive? Passivity in Europe is over. And I consider it as the motto of our thinking and acting today. The time of passivity is over, which means that we have to support all of us, everyone in the transatlantic community and among all the like-minded countries. We have to support Ukraine as much as we can and as quickly as we can. And what bothers me also in the European Union, that there are countries that are trying to do as little and as late as possible. So this is the time of saying farewell to being passive. This is one thing. And the other thing concerning the future of Ukraine, certainly Ukraine has done its best in order to enjoy the reputation of the most committed country to European values. It's not enough to talk about values, core principles on which our living together is based. They are fighting for this, and they are paying the highest price. So they are up to the challenge the war is posing to them. Now the question is whether we in the European Union are also up to this challenge. And what I mean here is the issue of the accession of Ukraine, and also of certainly of Moldova, Georgia, and so on. And we, the European Union, have committed many, many mistakes in the accession process of Western Balkans. It has lasted too long. We were not straightforward with them, with our partners in Western Balkans, and they are paying the price, and we are paying the price for that, because the countries from outside of our world of values are interfering there. And it's high time to draw the lesson from this experience. And what is necessary is a very transparent, very dynamic accession process for Ukraine. And if we manage to arrange it, not in the next decades, but in a couple of years, this is the most important issue, so that's something that we can do for the future of Ukraine. And if these two things are going to be achieved, I'm absolutely sure about the future of this brave country, because we will gain a very important friend and partner within the EU borders, who now they are freedom fighters, they are freedom protectors, because they are protecting us, and in the future they are going for decades to come. They are going to be freedom promoters. There is no doubt about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Wopke, Netherlands, typically, when the debates about enlargement in the EU very often is the critical voice of that. And we can understand that. And especially with Ukraine, there's a tragic history connected to that. How is the current situation changing your view?
You are already
how to convince generally the typical Western Europe, which is, and I understand that, maybe a little bit skeptical and want to adhere to certain nice, small, strong union. How to talk to you, and what should Ukraine prove to, for example, to Netherlands, that it's ready and fit and to be member of the EU?
Well, thank you very much, Jan, and thank you very much for organizing this.
Yeah.
And in my view, answering the set of questions that you posed, it starts with acknowledging that we, all of us, have been hit by an earthquake in February of this year. You never know exactly what historians will write when we are a couple of years down the line, but one thing is for sure, there is a clear schism and there will be a clear before and after. And many might say that actually it was a wake-up call in slow motion, and that there were many signs along the road that actually explained to us and that we should have seen that geopolitics never died, that imperialism was always there, but there is clearly a before and an after. And you can actually also see that by the response of the European Union and of friends from across the globe. Because if you see what the European Union and other friends of Ukraine have done in terms of supplying weapons, in terms of humanitarian aid, in terms of harboring refugees, even the countries that might have been skeptic on harboring refugees in general. If you look at the amount of sanctions that the European Union and others have come up with, if you look at that whole set of measures that we have been taken, I think that is without any precedent. And it is certainly something many in this room and across the globe wouldn't have expected from the European Union, including Vladimir Putin. I think there is a tremendous miscalculation in the Kremlin about the fighting spirit of Ukraine, the ability and the will to defend itself, but also in the whole Western response to it, which has been much more accurate, much more coherent, and much more united than many, including the Kremlin, would have expected. And my view is that we do need to continue to help out Ukraine as long as it takes on each and every one of these dimensions. And of course, some of them are linked to the European Union, such as sanctions. Others, like weapon supplies, are much more linked to individual countries. But it is with reason that I think all the countries here around the table and many others have done more than their fair share, because they see and they acknowledge what is at stake. And to me, that has also been at the heart of the decision of all European countries to say that even though it is without precedent, even though we have looked at the accession process differently in the past, geopolitics is back, and geopolitics should be taken into account when talking about enlargement. And it is that very acknowledgement that has enabled us to make this decision, again, without precedent and with all sorts of difficulties potentially on the road, to allow Ukraine this status. I think it is a wise decision, and it is much more than simple symbolism. It acknowledges the geopolitical situation and the danger that we face on our continent. It pays tribute to the situation in which Ukraine currently is, and it shows that we will see this through, that there is a joint future for the European Union and Ukraine, and we will do whatever is necessary. Thank you.
Thank you. We have 5 minutes, so I propose that we do one quick round. Dmitro, Ukraine was granted the candidate status with several conditions. How do you see the fulfillment of these conditions?
Listen, our full life is about conditions. We got used to it. Yes, we don't. Well, the only thing that we want is to be treated fairly in the assessment of the implementation of conditions. We have done out of 7. The polite word for conditions is recommendations. So out of 7 recommendations put forward by the European Commission in connection to granting the candidacy status to Ukraine, we have already implemented 1 in full. We appointed the anti-corruption prosecutor. We have launched the selection procedure for the head of the Anti-Corruption Bureau. Believe me, we are very much committed. We know what is at stake, and we are very committed to implementing these recommendations and to asking the next question, not what is next, but when is next. And I think we all deserve a little bit of optimism here, because traditionally, when someone speaks about Ukraine's European integration, the natural way is to always add a second sentence. Well, it may take years, it may take a lot of time. And what if it doesn't? 3 months ago, no one believed Ukraine would be a candidate country. We were hearing the same story. Well, it will take time, many years, until we reach there. And by the way, I would like to commend, of course, all countries who supported this decision, but in particular Germany and the Netherlands who supported the candidacy. And it was a milestone decision for them. So now we are candidates. We are moving, we are implementing the recommendations. And if we are ready to act fast, the European Union has to act fast too. And as you said, maybe it will not happen in a night, the EU membership, but it may happen in 2 nights, not in years. So that's our plan.
Couple of nights.
Whatever you mean under night. Yes.
How do you see, Anna-Lena, the discussion in the EU about the beginning of the accession process? Is it a formality? Is it a big thing?
Well, I think it's a huge thing. The whole step that Ukraine will become, and this is not a time question, this is Ukraine will become EU member. Full stop. And I think we have to make clear, because we are in a time of war, and we also on this panel, I mean, we agree on 99% here on the panel. And we have, like, maybe this is human, but this is probably politics, always find then this 1% where we disagree. And this is life. I mean, in every family we disagree. Nobody is like 100% agreeing on anything, even what you want to have for dinner in a family. But in this time, I think it's very important to see where we agree. And this is really tremendous, not only for Ukraine, but for the European Union. I mean, like 2 years ago, there were probably half of the room would have said, so what is the reason for joining even the EU? I mean, this is a project, I mean, for peace, but peace is given anyhow. And now we see, no, peace doesn't fall from the sky, unfortunately not. We have to defend it and we have to fight for it. And we see how important values are. And we also see, and we have learned that again in Germany, that interest and values are now different stories. They are one side of the same coin. They are two different sides of one coin. This all belongs to each other. I think this is really the moment we have to also acknowledge what we have achieved, even in times of war. We have achieved what Putin feared the most, unity in the European Union. We have achieved that Ukraine will become an EU member. A couple of years ago, the discussion was, no, Ukraine cannot become a member of the European Union. Finland and Sweden will join NATO, even though the countries didn't want to join NATO. Now they are joining NATO. And to also tell this story, even though it's hard and even though it's totally different in Ukraine, but to say if you're breaching with fundamental rights, with international law, so heavily as Russia did, then you get the opposition from most part of the world, and not only from the EU, not only from G7, not only from NATO, but from 141 states. And I think it's also not a story from the West against Russia. No, this is a story from those who believe in international law, who believe in human rights, who believe in liberty, and most of them also in democracy. And it will take as long as it needs, but in the end we will win, and I think this is where we have to focus on these times, and not where we disagree, but where we agree and fight for it all together.
Your country is also renowned with justice and with the court. And in Ukraine now the huge injustice is taking place. So how that plays, how that fits into the overall picture of bringing Ukraine into the Europe, into the EU?
You know, I think one thing is very clear also from this panel is that we are all committed to make sure that Ukraine wins this war. That is first and foremost, that is top of mind. However, we do know that the most horrific things have been taking place and are still taking place. And Annalena and I were there a couple of months ago. We talked to people in some of the villages that were hit the most, and the stories are truly breathtaking. If you think about the rape of women, the rape sometimes of men, children's toys to which booby traps are being attached, and what that does to the civilian population, to me one thing is crystal clear. We cannot let that happen, and we will not let that happen. And we do know it always takes years to make sure that justice will be done. That typically you can only touch a fraction of all the crimes that have been committed. But let's make sure as an international community and as a European Union, and with everyone who believes in the universality of human rights and everyone who wants to stand up against these type of crimes, that we bring the people who did this at a level, at a military level, but also at a political level, that we bring them to justice. We owe that to the victims, and we owe that to future generations.
Last but not least, question to you, Zbigniew. How would you define the success of Ukraine in this war?
So far or in the future? The success of Ukraine?
Success of Ukraine in this war.
Well, success of Ukraine in this war is more than clear. First of all, Ukraine has to regain occupied territories. Then it has caused Russia to become so weak that it would never think about any kind of continuation of its imperial policy, which means that each and every a neighbor of Russia will finally feel free from the danger of being invaded. And the third point, even more important, we know from Russian history very well that when Russia faces a military defeat, this kind of experience starts a profound discourse, inner discourse within Russia. This took place after the Russian-Japanese War. This took place after the failure of the Russian invasion in Afghanistan. First, it was the revolution of 1905, which changed Russia considerably. And after the defeat, after the failure in Afghanistan, perestroika took place. So Russia, I still naively, perhaps romantically believe that Russia still has a chance to go back to its splendid but very narrow tradition of the decabrists, of Andrei Sakharov, and so on. And if the Ukrainian victory can lead to that, we will all win this war. The free world will win this war. Thank you.
So, thank you very much to all of you. Time is up. Thank you very much for taking part in this conference, and see you on the other occasions. Thank you.
It was over-optimistic on my part.
Perception
becomes reality, as I said.
Thank you.